Okay, so we're already having technical difficulties. That's never great. I might have to restart here. I did get a new microphone, so that's what I'm testing out right now. Some weird green flashing going on. Oh. Okay, I think we're good now. Had to fix that. I'm going to test out this new microphone here to start, just to get the volume set up. It's sounding all right. Okay, I think we're good to go ahead and start. I'm going to start off actually something that's not in the description or anything. Just some videos from over the weekend here of the Ukrainians using incendiary This actually isn't white phosphorus. It's, like I said, it's incendiary munitions. The point of it is to set stuff on fire, right? It's effective against, say, an enemy force in a wooded area. It's not effective, however, against, you know, a city with concrete buildings. You're not going to set concrete on fire. This is just to terrorize civilians, right? That's what the Ukrainians do. It's what they've done for 8 years. They're continuing to do it, and I've heard nothing of this in Western media, right? I mean, look at this. This is a complete civilian. These are apartment buildings, it looks like, and just incendiary munitions raining down on them. So, the Ukrainians are terrorizing civilians. It's what they do. It's not what they talk about in Western media.
Блин, там моя машина.
The real Ukrainian government. It's not a place that loves peace, or the government doesn't love peace and democracy, right? They love quite the opposite things. And then there was one more thing I wanted to show. From this, here's another view of more incendiary munitions raining down from the sky. I mean, it's literally raining fire. The Ukrainians are raining fire on apartments, right? And we're supposed to believe Russia's the bad guy in this conflict. There was one more video here I wanted to show. This is a Russian air defense system over Donetsk city intercepting Ukrainian missiles. This is the interceptor missile here, and it hits its target here, intercepts the Ukrainian missile. So yeah, the Ukrainians are continuing to terrorize civilians in Donbass, and that's what Russia's putting a stop to, right? That's why Russia's completely justified here. Somebody has to put a stop to it, and Russia's clearly the best people to do it. Okay, so now we'll get started on what I have in the description and whatnot. We're going to start off here with Turkey. Specifically, Joe Biden's administration being upset with Turkey. This article here, all these articles are, actually this is from yesterday, but this is from July 24th. And, you know, it talks about how apparently the Biden administration is quite upset with Turkey due to Turkey kind of being neutral, playing a middle ground, not sanctioning Russia, even though they're a member of NATO. They're not being super aggressive towards Russia. They're really the only NATO member like that. I mean, just last week, Erdogan, the leader here of Turkey, met with Putin and Raisi, the leader of Iran, in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And, yeah, they had a meeting, you know, and those are both, you know, if you ask the American administration, the American government, they view Iran and Russia as two of their major enemies. And, you know, you have a member of NATO here, the leader of a NATO country meeting with both of those leaders. It's a big deal, right? And, I mean, it shouldn't be a shock to have NATO leaders meeting with leaders of Russia and Iran, but sadly it is, right? Because the NATO leaders are intransigent children, right? And they refuse to talk to their counterparts. It's really gross, but we'll read through the article here a little bit. Ankara, the capital, involvement in the UN brokered deal on Ukrainian grain exports between Moscow and Kiev a few days ago was welcomed by Washington, but didn't mean that all problems in U.S.-Turkish relations have been sorted out. The outlet warned in Saturday's article, the outlet being the New York Times. Turkish President Erdogan has been described as a, quote, headache and, quote, a source of substantial irritation, unquote, for Washington. It's very interesting. I've always, I like to follow Turkey closely because they're a very interesting country, right? They walk this tightrope of working with Russia, Iran, China, right? They're working with these countries and also being a member of NATO. It's very interesting. Not only are they friendly with the West, but they're a member of NATO, right? It's very interesting to see a country like that working with these other countries. Right here it talks about Erdogan and Putin and Raisi meeting. The images of the two prime American rivals with Mr. Erdogan, the leader of a NATO country, clashed with the Western narrative of a deeply isolated Iran and Russia. Right? That's because the Western narrative is typically completely made up on almost everything, right? It typically has grains of truth, but it's almost completely false all the time. Obviously, Russia's not isolated. Iran is not completely isolated either. It's becoming increasingly hard for the West to isolate countries, and that's a good thing. The article goes on to talk a little bit more about, it talks about Syria a bit. Down here, it's interesting, the Turkish leader might especially be inclined to quash the bids of Sweden and Finland joining NATO, as Congress seems unlikely to allow Biden to fulfill his promise of selling F-16 fighter jets to Ankara. Turkey is interested in those planes after the previous administration of Trump blocked the country from obtaining F-35s in response to the country's decision to arm itself with the Russian-made S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems. You might remember that from a couple years ago. It goes on to talk about Syria. Ankara has other grievances with Washington over, among other things, the U.S. reluctance to hand over exiled cleric Gulen, who was accused of masterminding a failed military coup in Turkey in 2016. And it goes on to talk about a few other things. Very interesting article. More of the topic is interesting. It's a good article. We'll move on from there to another Turkey thing. The leader, Erdogan, today said that he tried to explain Putin to the West, and I thought this was very interesting because obviously Putin is very misunderstood in the West. He's constantly misrepresented, right? And so it's interesting to see a NATO leader, the leader of a NATO country, somewhat defending Putin. He says, quote, the attitude of Western politicians towards Putin. This is him talking to some media person. I'm not 100% sure. Erdogan called the Western attitude towards Putin unbecoming of politics. The attitude you show him is the attitude you get in return, he says. He credited this insight for Ankara's ability to successfully negotiate the grain deal with both Moscow and Kiev on Friday. I'll cover that here in a second. Turkey had also hosted the initial talks between Ukraine and Russia in the early days of the conflict before the process broke down, reportedly at the urging of some Western leaders. Erdogan went on to say, "We are determined to put this agreement into practice," talking about the grain deal. Erdogan said of the grain deal, saying it would go a long way to ease the threat of a global food crisis. He urged both Russia and Ukraine to abide by what they signed at Istanbul. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Ankara does not regard either side as an enemy, Erdogan said. Turkey has not imposed sanctions against Russia, but it has spoken in opposition to Moscow's special operation in Ukraine, and it's sold Kiev combat drones. As for relations with Russia, Erdogan said that Turkey was focusing on issues of, quote, mutual benefit, unquote, such as the peace process for neighboring Syria as part of the Astana 3 initiative, which is the initiative that Iran, Turkey, and Russia have agreed to, which involves Syria. The only two countries that are, asked to be in Syria by the Syrian government are Russia and Iran. Turkey is not. Turkey and the United States are not asked to be there. Obviously, the United States doesn't do anything. Turkey isn't doing anything very helpful either. But it's a big deal that they're talking with the other two nations involved, right? The West won't even talk to Russia or Iran because they're children, like I said. Let's touch on that grain deal because that happened since the last time I streamed. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. This article is from the 22nd of July. It talks about a deal to unblock much-awaited grain exports from Ukraine. It was signed at the UN broker talks in Istanbul on Friday. So, obviously, Ukraine and Russia produce a large amount of the world's grain, and obviously Ukraine is having some troubles with getting their grain out. Specifically, the main reason Ukraine is having so much trouble is because they mine their own ports. Before Russia's military special operation began, they put sea mines in their own ports, and they've lost track of many of these. They've floated off into the sea, and it's very dangerous for ships to traverse that, especially civilian ships, especially trade ships, to traverse that, because there's a risk of running into a mine. That's one of the major issues with exporting grain right now. The West is trying to put it all on Russia and saying that they're not going to allow it to happen, and of course that's not what's happening. Russia's been working since day one to ensure that the grain gets out. They carried out a strike on a port at Odessa. Let me pull up a map here so you see. Odessa is right here, major port city. The Russians carried out a cruise missile strike on the port on I believe Saturday. They say that they hit a military target with Harpoon missiles. I think that's believable. But the West is saying this is a direct violation of their agreement they made with the grain deal. I actually don't know the complete ins and outs of this grain deal, but Russia is allowed to hit a military target, right? If they want to destroy missiles that are going to be used against them, there's no reason that they can't, right? Let's go on with this article a bit. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu and his Turkish counterpart signed an agreement with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, while Ukrainian Infrastructure Minister signed a separate document with Ankara, completing the deal. Let's see if it gets into the details at all. It doesn't look like it does. UN Secretary General warned in March that delays in shipments of wheat from Ukraine and Russia could lead to a hurricane of hunger and a meltdown of the global food system. He said that 45 African and other less developed countries received at least a third of their wheat from either Ukraine or Russia, and that for 18 of them, these exports make up at least 50%, right? So Ukrainian grain on the market, on the world market, is huge. It has to get there. COVID already drove many people into food insecurity, into starvation some, and this will only further that if Ukrainian grain doesn't reach the market. It's a very important thing to follow. We're going to move on from that now to the other thing I had in my title about the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. I'm actually going to play a video for you here in a second. She says the U.S. isn't in a recession or isn't in any kind of, economic trouble, which, is, of course, news to hundreds of millions of Americans, right? And, well, I'll save my analysis until after the video. Let me, here it is here.
Let me just start with this. Many businesses seem to be preparing for a recession. Should all Americans at home be preparing for for a recession that many people think now is likely?
Well, look, the economy is slowing down. Last year, it grew very rapidly at about 5.5%, and that succeeded in putting people back to work who had lost their jobs during the pandemic. The labor market is now extremely strong. Even just during the last 3 months, net job gains averaged 375,000. This is not an economy that's in recession, but we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing, and that's necessary and appropriate.
Let me just start with this. Many businesses...
So, right there she says, we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing, and that's necessary and appropriate, right? It's their degrowth strategy. It's very out in the open. They don't hide it, right? It's something they believe has to happen. I say they, right? I mean the sort of the neoliberal ruling elite in the West. They love degrowth, and this article kind of covers that a bit. Let's go through it. I mean, right off the jump here, she calls, a slowing of growth necessary and appropriate. She talks about job growth. The Biden administration has been talking about job growth since really the end of COVID restrictions, because a lot of people did lose their job during COVID. Service sector people were out of a job during COVID, but since COVID restrictions have ended, a lot of those jobs have come back. So to say job growth is kind of disingenuous, right? It's not so much job growth as recovery from where it was before. Just that when she says growth, the slowing down of growth is necessary and appropriate. That's really important, right? Because she's saying it out loud, right? She's saying degrowth is good. That they think degrowth is good. A lot of people, the so-called synthetic left people, they act like when us real anti-imperialists talk about how these people want degrowth, they act like we're crazy and we're just pulling this out of nowhere. No, they talk about it in the open. They're very open about it. It's what they want. And she totally, we'll read on here a bit. She totally changes the definition of a recession here. Normally historically, a recession is considered when an economy doesn't grow for two straight quarters, pretty much, right? 2 quarters of the year. That's what's happened with the U.S. economy. So just based off historical definition, the U.S. is in recession. But if we read on here, 2 straight quarters of economic contraction is typically viewed as a recession. Yellen acknowledged, but she tried to reframe how the trend should be defined, saying, quote, "We could see that happen, and that will be closely watched, but I do want to emphasize what a recession really means is a broad-based contraction in the economy," unquote. She went on to say, even if that number is negative, we are not in a recession now. I would warn that we should be not characterizing that as a recession. That's an interesting way to word that sentence. That's not what a recession is. What she's saying, and the reason she's saying that is because the ultra-rich aren't feeling this, right, at all. They're making huge amounts of money, right? If you're a member of an oil company or the military-industrial complex or really anything, you're making huge amounts of money. I mean, look how much money the private hospitals and pharmaceuticals just made from COVID, right? That's why Yellen is saying this isn't a recession, is because the ruling class doesn't it's not a recession for them, right? Their pockets have been getting fatter and fatter and fatter for the past couple years, right? And the pockets of most Americans, 90% of Americans, 95% of Americans, that's not the case. Pockets are getting skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, right? Look how much gas is, food is getting more expensive. That is why she's saying it isn't a recession, because the ultra rich don't feel it, just regular people feel it. She went on to say this is not an economy that's in recession, but we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing, and that's necessary and appropriate, right? The liberals, the neoliberal world order, if you want to call it that, they don't like growth. They make that very clear. Growth threatens them. It threatens the empire they've built, right? They're at the top. They've been at the top for decades, and they want to stay there, and they're going to stay there by limiting growth as much as they can. Yellen went on to say, we need to be growing at a steady and sustainable pace, so there is a slowdown, and businesses can see that, and that's appropriate, given that people now have jobs, and we have a strong labor market. Of course, when she says we have a strong labor market, she means from the perspective of people trying to make a lot of money off of labor, right? There's a lot of people that need jobs, and you don't have to pay them a whole lot. That's what she's talking about. She acknowledged that inflation is way too high. It's at the highest rate in more than 40 years, in fact, but she expressed confidence that actions by the Federal Reserve and Biden's policies will bring prices under control, saying, quote, "I'm not saying that we will definitely avoid a recession, but I think there's a path that keeps the labor market strong and brings inflation down." Well, we won't avoid a recession because we're in a recession, right? You don't get to just change the definition. She thinks she does, but she went on to say, Yellen said the Russian-Ukraine conflict would push oil prices even higher. Why? Why is that going to push oil prices in the U.S. higher, right? How much oil was it we imported from Russia before? It was like 4%, not a whole lot. Oil prices should not be rising drastically in the U.S., right? We produce a large amount. We bring in a large amount. She went on to say, there's another quote here, I believe. Yeah, she says, but I don't think that's a recession, right? So she gets to change the definition. And I actually have a funny tweet here from Jackson Hinkle. He says, people say Biden hasn't accomplished anything, but he says, I happen to believe that single-handedly changing the definition of vaccine, recession, and woman is quite the feat. That's pretty accurate. That's pretty funny. I mean, that's what they've done, right? They're doing it with the recession, before with the vaccine. I forget what the the health agencies considered a vaccine to be before, but they changed the definition so that Pfizer and Moderna could say that they have vaccines. Very funny tweet. Very funny tweet. But yeah, it's just absurd. She gets to change the definition of recession because the ultra rich aren't feeling it, right? That's who she works for. That's who they work for, and they're very out in the open about it, right? They're very out in the open about the degrowth policies and about not considering the needs of regular people. That's what this is all about, right? She truly believes what she's saying. I mean, obviously it looks like she's lying, but I believe she believes in what she's saying. She doesn't think they're in a recession because her pockets are getting skinnier, and the pockets of the people she's around all the time aren't, right? Let me close this article here. Yellen's interesting because I'm pretty sure she was like she worked for Goldman Sachs or someone before she got into government. I forget, maybe Goldman Sachs or somebody else. But she comes straight from the big bank, straight from Wall Street, right? That's who she works for. That's who she represents. That's why she doesn't think the U.S. is in a recession. Is because those people have been making a lot of money, and they're going to continue. Sadly, we're going to move on from that into the UK. Europe is on the brink of collapse. The whole West is, but especially Western Europe, right? I've talked about it on these streams before. Let me take a drink of water. I've talked about it on these streams before. The West is obviously in a recession and, somewhat collapsing, especially Western Europe. This winter in Western Europe is going to be very, very bad for people, unless they somehow figure out how to get a lot more gas without using Russia. Right, they're talking about blackouts in the UK and asking people to prepare for them. They said they'll pay people to not use get as much electricity. Here's a statistic here with annual household bills expected to surpass 3,300 euros, which is about $4,000, according to the energy consultant Cornwall Insight. The article reads, the National Grid has asked electricity suppliers to establish ways to pay households to shift their energy usage to times of peak supply, such as during strong winds, and reduced use at other times. The UK actually does produce a lot of its electricity from offshore windmills. I forget the exact number, but it's something along the lines of like 30%. It's quite a bit. But most of it does come from natural gas, right? Because that's, other than nuclear power, natural gas is really the most efficient way to produce electricity right now in this stage of human development, right? So they need a lot of that. Europe needs a lot of that. They're not getting a lot now that they're sanctioning Russia. They'll try to get it from other places, but there's no way they could replace those the amount that they need in the amount of time they have, right? This winter is going to be very bad for Europe. It'll be bad for the United States, very bad for Europe, catastrophic, possibly for Europe. Staying on the UK, obviously since Boris Johnson, was ousted, there's been question on who will take over. The two leading candidates here seem to be these people, Sunak, which is this fellow here, and this woman, I forget her name, Liz Truss. Yeah, Liz Truss is the one that's expected here. They're both somewhat similar. I believe they're from the same party, the Tory party, and this fella, Sunak, he's not as hostile towards Russia and China historically. Liz Truss is incredibly hostile towards Russia and China. Sunak actually not recently, but in the last year, talked about increasing business ties with Russia and China for the UK. But since he's gotten into this position where he could possibly be prime minister, he's competing with Liz Truss and starting to be very, very hostile towards Moscow and Beijing, right? The article says, claiming that Beijing is now, quote, infiltrating our universities and stealing our technology, racist scaremongering, talking points which originated from the Trump administration. Sunak will call for strengthening NATO cooperation against China and will pledge to close all 30 Confucius Institutes in the country. Confucius Institutes are they're like Chinese-sponsored universities somewhat that it teaches Chinese language and whatnot, and they've always been attacked for people will say that it's like a Chinese intelligence op. There's really no evidence for that. If we keep reading on, to most Tory hawks, however, Sunak's rhetoric isn't convincing. Only as recently as January did he in fact vow to deepen business ties between China and the UK. His change, of course, is blatantly motivated by his desire to become the leader of the party and pander to a right-wing populist base who overwhelmingly favor his opponent Liz Truss, who models herself quite explicitly after Margaret Thatcher. As the first ever ethnic minority candidate for conservative leadership, it isn't rocket science to see why he is at a disadvantage in such circumstances. This is actually an op-ed article. I do want to point that out. You can see that the author is touching, he's claiming that there's racism involved here. I don't know about that, right? I'm not in the UK. It wouldn't surprise me, though. Really what I want to touch on, though, is Truss and Sunak. They're both, being incredibly hawkish towards Russia and China. Truss seems to be a bit more, much more sincere in her hawkishness towards these two countries, just based off their records, right? Sunak was talking about expanding ties with China before he got in this position, right? If we continue on with the article, there is one more thing I wanted to touch on. I believe it's down at the bottom. Yeah, here in this last paragraph reads, now we're at the stage where an Indian origin British politician, which is Sunak, feels he could solicit political gain for himself by weaponizing fear, hate, and scaremongering against Chinese people. It's very similar to what you see politicians doing here in the U.S., especially in the Midwest and conservative areas. The article goes on to say, betraying the diverse and open country where his parents settled and which allowed him to become so successful. It is a sorry state of affairs, and this aggressive pursuit of burning bridges and geopolitical confrontation will undoubtedly, as it has already, place further strain on the British economy, already beset by surging inflation, shrinking incomes, growing industrial unrest, and eye-watering inequality. While of course Liz Truss looks to be an almost inevitable victor, the fact someone like her is in the position speaks volumes about not her ascent, but about Britain's descent. If you thought Boris Johnson was bad, things are about to get a whole lot worse. The article reads, saying on multiple fronts we're going to see the UK now take the deep turn of right-wing regression the US has been experiencing, right? The US went through this with Trump, right? Trump got into office, and especially in his 2020 campaign, he ran a lot on China. He always would talk about China and countering China. He was very hawkish towards China. That's what Liz Truss is doing, right? Almost think of her as a female British Trump, right? Pretty interesting. Things are just not going good for Europe. They're going to get worse, it looks. I mean, this is ridiculous. The article mentions that, right, the inflation, everything going on in Europe, they're already facing economic disaster this winter. And now they want to make it even worse by, isolating themselves from the world's largest economy. And you have to wonder, is Liz Truss, where's American intelligence? Are they working with Liz Truss? Obviously the Americans want to isolate China and get as many countries on board with their anti-China stuff as possible. So it's not crazy to think that American intelligence is working alongside with her, right, or telling her what to do. That's just my speculation, though. Obviously, I've never been to Britain. I don't live there, so I don't know too much, but that wouldn't surprise me at all. I wanted to touch on that because obviously it's very important to talk about the leader of the UK or the potential leader of the UK. Staying on the EU or staying on Europe here, the EU announced its plan for Russian gas substitute. They've recently talked about Nigeria, right? They're going to go and take more gas to the people of Nigeria, right? Nigeria is an incredibly poor country, yet they produce a huge amount of gas. I believe it might be the most in Africa of any African country, right? So why are the people so poor that they produce all that, right? It's because it's being stolen by the West, and now they're going to attempt to steal more. The article says the EU is Nigeria's major liquid natural gas buyer, with 60% of all LNG shipments from the country going to Europe, accounting for 14% of the bloc's gas imports. We want to expand what is currently a 14% share of total liquid natural gas imports from Nigeria. We want that to go up. He added that the EU is seeking to expand their short-term natural gas deliveries from Nigeria, but at the moment, the capacity, the utilization rate of Nigerian liquid natural gas is too low. Bringing in, let's read these stats here real quick. The EU is the world's largest liquid natural gas importer. In 2021, the bloc purchased 80 billion cubic meters of LNG. Among the union's major LNG suppliers are the U.S. at 28%, Qatar and Russia 20% each, Nigeria 14%, Algeria 11%. So they're attempting to replace 20%, right? That 20% from Russia is what they're trying to replace. That's a massive amount, right? 1/5 of Europe's natural gas usage, pretty much. And when it comes to bringing in natural gas from ships, it's much more complicated than with say a pipeline like the Nordstrom pipelines, which are already built and could easily be used. I see. Somebody's telling me to turn my volume up. Hopefully that's a bit better. Bringing in natural gas is very much harder from the sea. You have to have special ports built for it. I can't expand my video box here. Well, that's annoying. But there has to be special ports, there has to be special infrastructure, and Europe doesn't have enough of that infrastructure to bring in that much from the sea. France has actually tried to build more. They tried to build 2 more of these ports. My cats are fighting. I don't know if you can hear that, but France has tried to build 2 more of these ports, and they won't be ready for years, right? So it takes years to build the infrastructure capable of bringing in that much liquid natural gas from the sea, right? The easiest route for Europe to bring in liquid natural gas are pipelines from Russia, right? Already existing pipelines, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. There's the pipelines that run through Ukraine. That is the easiest way for Europe to bring in that natural gas. But of course, they're not going to do that because they are, they're puppets of the U.S. pretty much, right? I've said it before in these streams. The European Union is neither European nor a union, right? The countries aren't very close. It's not a union, and it's not European because they do whatever America wants, and that's what's going on here, right? The Americans want Europe and poverty pretty much to try to hurt Russia. It's not going to hurt Russia, right? It's going to hurt Europe, and I think that might be somewhat of what Wall Street wants. They want Europe to be devastated because then they can go in and buy everything in Europe that isn't already bought by them or owned by them, right? They're trying to drive Europe into extreme poverty. You see this with every policy Europe is putting through, whether it's the anti-Russia sanctions or the organic farming bills, which is going to decrease the amount of food when there's already food insecurity. It's absurd, right? The EU, it's not European nor Union. It's descending into chaos on behalf of America is what's going on. It's really sad to see. It's so obvious in the open. Every time I see videos of people interviewing Europeans on the streets, the Europeans do seem to be a bit more knowledgeable about their politics than Americans. I'm really interested. I'd be really interested in seeing how many Europeans see this. How many Europeans see that the United States is purposely destroying their countries, right? I imagine it's quite a bit. Staying on the topic of European natural gas, Russia's Gazprom, the state-owned natural gas company, is going to disable a second pipeline turbine, and the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. That's the Nord Stream pipeline that has been in operation for, I believe, a decade or so. One of the turbines was being repaired in Canada, and returning of the turbine was delayed because of the sanctions, right? So the sanctions are hurting Europe far more than it's hurting Russia, right? I mean, Russia's been hurt, right? They stole $750 billion of Russian money that were in overseas accounts, right? So it's hurt Russia for sure, but it's devastating Europe. Russia's recovering, right? The Russian people are feeling this much less than the European people or even the American people, right? I could just hammer away at it, right? The cost of gas, the cost of food. We could just talk about it all day. The West are the ones feeling the effects of these sanctions. So Nord Stream 1, 20% of the pipeline's capacity is what's being shut down here. Gazprom says the decision to switch off the turbine was made based on its technical condition and the fact that it's due for an overhaul. A spokesperson for Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs has reportedly said that there are no technical reasons to reduce gas supply via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. According to an earlier report by Kommersant, several of the 9 turbines at the Porto Vella compressor station are in need of repair. The paper notes that Gazprom has not yet authorized further repairs and that one turbine took about 3 months to overhaul. The current licensing agreement allows Siemens Energy to accept 5 more turbines for repair before the end of 2024. This follows a dispute between Russia, Canada, and Germany over a Siemens turbine that had been sent to Montreal for repairs and was not returned on time due to Ottawa's sanctions against Moscow. Gazprom cited the delay as the reason for a 60% reduction in gas flow to Germany last month. Canada eventually sent the part to Germany, where it is currently awaiting shipment to Russia. Gazprom said earlier on Monday that the paperwork it had received from Canada and Siemens regarding the shipment of the turbine did not clear up sanctions-related questions. Last week, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz suggested that Berlin could no longer rely on Moscow when it came to gas supplies, and said he wasn't convinced by Russia's statements that the repaired Siemens turbine that had been delayed was necessary. Very interesting. So I can't touch on if the turbine needed repaired or not. I have no idea about that, but it's interesting to see these sanctions hurting Europe more than Russia, right? They can't get the part they need for their turbine because of the sanctions. They're already short of gas. They expect to be massively short of gas come this winter, and they're just shooting themselves in the front foot. I could touch on it all day. We could just keep talking over and over about how the EU is destroying itself. It's really sad. Foreign spies tried to force me to take anti-Russia stance, says the Serbian minister. I thought this was interesting. He says one of the largest intelligence services in the world, if not the largest, told me that my stance was unacceptable, and that if I do not change and do not abandon the policy that I am pursuing, then I will not be a member of the government, and they will do absolutely everything to smear me, said Alexander Vulin. He expects a media campaign against him to begin next week. Despite the pressure, the minister said he refused to cooperate in any way with foreign spies. Quote, I haven't worked and won't work for anyone except for the Serbian people, the Serbian state, and I won't be completely loyal to anyone except for the president of all Serbs, right? Serbia is trying to stay neutral, very understandable, and they're being attacked for that. The U.S., the neoliberals of the world, they can't handle any dissent. Everybody has to be full lockstep, or they can't exist at all in their mind, the neoliberals' minds, right? They can't handle any form of going against what they want, right? They can't handle any of it. And, they always talk about here in the West, they love to talk about now about foreign interference in American elections. They typically on Russia, obviously everyone remembers Russiagate. They always talk about that. They never talk about America's interference in elections, actual interference, right? The interference they always claim can never be proven, right? Every time there's an investigation, nothing comes of it. But this is an example of them doing it almost in the open, right? I mean, I guess it's not in the open, but he's exposing it. So it's now in the open. But, the U.S., the intelligence agency, the CIA, who I assume he's talking about here, they interfere in every election, right? And if their interference doesn't work and the person they don't want to win an election wins, then what do? They kill that person, or they orchestrate some type of coup, right? They did it in Pakistan not too long ago. They do it everywhere, right? The U.S. is the greatest violator of democracy in the world, both at home and abroad, right? They interfere in every election on every continent. There's not an election in the world that the U.S. doesn't try to interfere in, and they try to point the finger at everybody else, right? It's classic. It's classic liar behavior, right? The empire of lies. It's classic behavior. If you're doing something, lie and say the people you're doing it to, they're the ones really doing it, right? It's textbook stuff. It's not hard to understand where they come from. These people aren't very smart, right? I frequently talk about people, the so-called leaders in the West. I call them educated idiots, because that's what they are, right? They're educated. They went to a nice school or whatever, but they're idiots. Right, and it's not easy. I mean, it's not hard to see through their bullshit. It really isn't. This, I thought, is a hilarious article. Top U.S. General Mark Milley, he's the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's of course being aggressive towards China. He says China has become increasingly aggressive in encounters with other military forces operating in the Asia-Pacific region, making itself a greater threat to the U.S. and its allies. When he talks about the Asia-Pacific region, he's specifically talking about the South China Sea. The U.S. is always carrying out military exercises in the South China Sea, and China responds to this because it's the South China Sea. It's right. It's in their backyard, and it's just so ridiculous, the hypocrisy of these Western countries. They carry out these military operations, and then they expect the countries to not respond, right? They do this with Iran all the time in the Persian Gulf. They're very aggressive to Iran, and then Iranian ships will you can say harass, whatever. They'll respond to the American ships in the Persian Gulf, and the Americans will say, "Look, Iranian aggression." Meanwhile, where is this so-called Iranian aggression taking place? It's in Iran's backyard, right? In the Persian Gulf. Iran is Persia, right? And they're doing the same thing here to China. They're being incredibly aggressive towards China, specifically in the South China Sea. And then when China responds in any way, they're called aggressive and hostile. And why would China be so hostile? Why, you're being hostile, right? China's defending its land. It's defending its territorial waters. You're being hostile, right? He goes on to say that The number of such interceptions deemed unsafe by the Pentagon has escalated. The general recently ordered his staff to compile a report detailing interactions between Chinese forces and the U.S. and its allies in the region. The article says in one such incident last month, a Chinese J-16, which is a fighter jet, allegedly endangered the crew of an Australian surveillance plane in international airspace. Right? It's just so ridiculous, man. It's so ridiculous. We're just supposed to go with this narrative of these countries are hostile because they respond to, our government's hostile acts. It's ridiculous, right? They're not the hostile ones. You're in their backyard. You're on their doorstep. If somebody was on the sidewalk in front of your house shooting a gun in the air and you responded to them, if you shot at them, are you the one? Are you the one starting aggression, or are they? Right? They're the one starting the aggression, right? And that's what's going on here. And we're supposed to hate Russia. We're supposed to hate China. We're supposed to hate Iran. And whenever China, Iran, Russia, whenever any of these countries do anything that is in their national interest, we're supposed to view it as aggression, right? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Staying on the China topic, the yuan recently on, I believe, the Russian stock exchange is trading higher than the euro for the first time ever in that exchange. It's very interesting. According to the data, the trading volume of the Chinese currency on Friday was 52.8 billion rubles, $908 million. The euro trading value, meanwhile, barely exceeded 41 billion rubles, $705 million. It also was the second consecutive day when the volume of yuan trading on the Moscow exchange exceeded 50 billion rubles, while in the first half of July, the yuan trading volume had averaged 30 billion rubles a day. The yuan failed to overtake the U.S. dollar, however, with Friday's greenback trading volume reaching 124.7 billion rubles, $2.1 billion. So the greenback, the U.S. dollar, right? It's still the top dog, if you will, but the yuan is gaining, and that'll likely continue, right? We'll likely see that continue for years, right? More and more countries seem to be moving away from the dollar a bit. You see Saudi Arabia talking about selling oil and yuan. That would be massive, right? The petrodollar is what has kept the U.S. dollar afloat. I've talked about that a bit on this stream, right? Saudi Arabia and the other Arab Gulf, the other, Arab monarchy states, they sell their oil in American dollars and only American dollars. And in exchange for that, the U.S. gives them military support, basically. And that's what's happened for years, for decades, right? Since the 60s. And that's created an artificial demand for U.S. dollars. So the true demand for the U.S. dollar is not what's really existed. And that's where we're seeing this inflation coming from now, right? The international demand for the U.S. dollar is shrinking, and because of that, inflation rates are rising. And we're going to continue to see that, right? As the petrodollar continues to get weaker and weaker, and Saudi Arabia seems to move farther and farther away from the United States, unless something massive changes. But I don't see that happening. I thought this was funny. Really, I just wanted to show this picture. China offers West advice on Ukraine, and it's a picture here of China sit down and negotiate for peace, and then the West says wash only 4 parts of the body to piss off Putin, right? That's what the West is doing pretty much, right? Lower your living standards to fight Putin instead of the West sitting down and actually talking to Russia and trying to find common ground, actually solve things. The people are just supposed to lower their living standards to fight Putin. It's absurd, right? We've talked about this stuff on streams before. China warns of consequences if Pelosi sticks to Taiwan visit. Pelosi's supposed to go to Taiwan in August with various other American lawmakers. She'd be the most senior U.S. official to visit the island since 1997, right? Speaker of the House. That's third in line for the presidency, right? So it's a massive deal, and the Chinese, of course, don't like that, right? Because Taiwan is China, and that's something Taiwan agrees on, right? Taiwan believes that they're China. China believes Taiwan is a province of China, right? And that's what people don't understand in the West. We view them as two separate countries here in the West, and we think that's how their mindset is, but it isn't, right? Taiwan views themselves as the true China. They view themselves as sort of the capital of China, if you will. They call themselves the Republic of China. And then the real China, right? The People's Republic of China. They view Taiwan as a province of China. So whenever people in the West talk about talk about Taiwan and China as if they're two different countries, that's not really the case. And even Taiwan and China agree with that, right? They view themselves as one country. So Pelosi going there, of course, makes the People's Republic of China, the real China, very upset, because if she wants to visit China, why doesn't she visit Beijing, right? Why doesn't she visit the real capital, right? And they just want to upset China, right? That's what that's what the U.S. wants. They want to provoke China into somehow attacking Taiwan. That's where their focus is going to go, probably later this year when the operation in Ukraine ends. They're going to try to provoke China into attacking Taiwan. I don't know if China would ever do that, right? Unless they were really, really forced to, because like we've said here, they both view themselves as China. Why would they attack Chinese people, right? But that's what they want. They want China to attack Taiwan so that they could try to isolate China on the international markets, right? It's the same strategy with Ukraine. It's the exact same strategy with Ukraine, pretty much. Ukraine and Russia. They provoked Russia into carrying out an operation, a very justified operation in Ukraine, and now they're trying to use that operation as a reason to isolate Russia. And it's not really working, as we've seen, and it won't work with China. It'll work even less with China, right? If you think countries depend on Russia, wait until this happens with China. The U.S. depends on China, right? It's funny, right? The neoliberals, they decided, okay, we're going to start relying on trading with China for the basis of our economy, right? The basis of our economy is going to involve trade with China, and now they're trying to isolate China, and they're trying to drive a gap in between themselves and China. What do you think that's going to do to your economy? Right, if your economy depends on trading with a country, and then you start being hostile towards that country, then that's not going to be good for your economy, and that's what's going on here, right? They want to try to isolate China, and they're going to use China attacking Taiwan, if China ever does, as a reason for that isolation. But it won't work. It didn't work with Ukraine and Russia, really, just Western Europe, right? And that's what we'll see here too. If China ever does attack Taiwan, it'll be the same thing. Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, right? The typical Western aligned countries, they'll be very upset with China, and they'll sanction China, but no one else will join them. India won't join them. Pakistan won't join them. Iran won't join them. And Africa, right? Almost all of Africa. Only 4 countries the other day attended. Only 4 African countries attended a call with Zelensky the other day. Right, so Africa has no interest in this bullshit. South Africa won't, right? No country is going to kill themselves so that these neoliberals can try to stay on top. And that's what the neoliberals will have to understand, or they don't really care to understand. They're just going to have to learn it the hard way, I guess. I'm very warm. It's been very, very warm here in the Midwest. I know it's been warm across all the U.S. as well. Hopefully that changes soon, right? I don't really remember opening this article. Ukraine grain ships may move soon. That would be very good. Hopefully they can avoid mines. We'll move past this. This is something I wanted to touch on. I've talked about it on streams before. I'm a big follower of what's going on with space and space exploration. Obviously, space is the future for humanity. If we ever want fusion power, if we ever want unlimited resources, it has to come from space. And sadly, the U.S. doesn't do as much in space as they could, but China is doing quite a bit, and they just launched another module for their space station. It's a very big deal. The space station is called a Heavenly Palace, kind of a cool name. They plan on it to be in service for about 10 years, probably longer. That's what typically happens in space, is these spacecraft are at first, it's 10 years or 20 years typically, but typically they end up lasting much longer than that, and that's probably what will happen here. The ISS, the International Space Station, was only supposed to be around, I believe, for until 2010, 2015, and it's still around, and they plan to decommission it in 2030. That's probably what will happen with the Chinese space station, but yeah, space is very important, right? If we want fusion power, we need the helium-3 from the moon. If we want unlimited unlimited metals, right? Look how important metals are for electronics and things. If we want an unlimited source of those things, and we don't want to continue to harm Earth's environment by harvesting those resources here, asteroids are where we go. And I've said this a lot. A lot of people hear that and they think, well, that's science fiction. That's so far fetched. It's not really. We're not far from that at all. China's showing that there's corporations in the West that have designed. They've made designs for how to mine asteroids. We're not far from that at all. A few decades. You're right. China wants to have a base on the moon mining helium-3 by 2050. They seem to be on track to do that. They have a really, really, really good lunar program going on. And